known as the Nation of the Jews, a name not having been applied to any part of the Hebrew nation prior to the Babylonian captivity. Josephus also records that the returning Judeans brought back with them some of the Babylonian customs and religious rites. This would explain why Jesus bitterly criticized the Jerusalem priesthood for allowing Babylonian traditions to pollute the Mosaic law. The Jewish theologian Dr. H. Gretz, in his History of the Jews, writes, "The Babylonian, rather than the Jerusalem Talmud, became the fundamental possession of the Jewish race, its life breath, its very soul." In other words, the Judean Israelites returned from Babylon marked the end of Hebrewism and its ties with the Old Testament, the beginning of Judaism, which today is erroneously linked with Christianity. Jerusalem was now populated with multiracial people at the time when work started on the rebuilding of the city walls and the temple, but not without many intergroup altercations and disharmony. While the rebuilding of the city continued, the vast majority of the nation of Israel, both the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel, once the richest and most powerful of the nations of the Middle East, remained in captivity and servitude. Was this to be the final chapter in a people once chosen by Almighty God for his special purposes here on earth? Had God made a mistake in choosing Israel? And if they were a specially chosen people for a task, how was it that they seemingly vanished from sight into obscurity? Lost to the uncaring world, maybe, but not to God. The Almighty knew Israel's past, present, and future, and did her pre-planned destiny. Overlooked by many of today's theologians, the so-called minor prophets, Hosea and Amos, foretold the captivities of Israel, but also prophesied that they would not remain lost, but would eventually be restored as a nation. If secular historians have found no mention of Israel in ancient records, the reason is very simple. Their various captors did not call them by their original name, but devised their own names for them. One example of this can be seen in the Assyrian Gallery in the British Museum. This is the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III of Assyria. On one section of the obelisk is a pictograph of King Jehu of Israel paying tribute to Shalmaneser. And the inscription reads, "The tribute of Eah of Beth Cumri." That is, the tribute of Jehu of the house of Omri. Omri was one of the kings of northern Israel, and the Assyrians knew them as Beth Cumri, or house of Omri. Although the Assyrians continued to call captive Israel by this name, Israel continued to call themselves by their old and ancient name, Beth Isaac, or house of Isaac. This name was also well known to the Assyrians, but they rendered it Iskasa, or Sakasini, Saka from Isaac, or Isaac's sons. We know the word today as Saxon. Since the scriptures state that captive Israel would not remain lost forever, I will repeat the question: what happened to them? Our first clues as to the ultimate fate of dispersed Israel was found by archaeologists excavating the ruins of Sargon II's royal palace at Nineveh. They were in the form of cuneiform tablets and were uncovered about a century ago. They were translated by Professor Waterman of Michigan University, but their relevance to Israel was completely overlooked at that time, owing to their complete disorder, lying as they were among some 1,400 other texts. One tablet dated 707 BC referred to a people called Gimri, who were living in an area into which Israel had been placed by the Assyrians earlier. The name Gimri is evidently a corruption of Assyria's name for Israel, Qumri. The tablets were reports from an Assyrian frontier post, reports which were forwarded to the king, and which stated that the forces of Urartu, that is, Ararat, enemies of Assyria, were mounting an invasion south of Lake Urmia in Media, an area where captive Israel had been placed. The report read, "When the king of Urartu came into the land of Gimri, his army was routed." Routed, obviously, by the local inhabitants, the Qumri or Gimri. So now we note that Israel, far from being a cowed or captive people, were beginning to assert themselves. The report also stated that these Gimri, as they were then called, made a counterattack, invaded Urartu, and captured all their military commanders. These cuneiform tablets not only confirm the findings of the various archaeological excavations, but they also identified the people who were responsible and where they came from. Another and later report stated that in the second year of the Assyrian king Esarhaddon, 670 BC, a sizable number of the Gimri rose in rebellion under their leader, Tuespa. And when the Assyrian army pursued them, they retreated westward, and although some were captured, the bulk of the people migrated westward, the vanguard of Israel's movement toward the west. So militarized had Israel now become that they invaded Lydia in Asia Minor and captured the town of Sardis in around 615 BC, and again in 600. However, settlement here was not to be. Later, they met their match in Gyges, king of Lydia, who forced Israel north, out of Asia Minor toward the Black Sea coast. Many of Israel crossed the Black Sea and settled in the Crimea, where there are gravestones with Hebrew biblical names on them. Most, however, encircled the coastlands and arrived in the area which is now the Ukraine. Quoting from the book of Esdras,
"And whereas thou sawest that he gathered another peaceable multitude to him, these are the 10 tribes which were carried away prisoners out of their own land in the time of Uzziah the king, whom Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria, led away captive. And he carried them over the waters, that is, the river Euphrates, and so they came into another land. But they took this counsel among themselves, that they would leave the multitude of the heathen, and go forth into another country, where never mankind dwelt, that they might there keep their statute which they never kept in their own land. And they entered into Euphrates by the narrow passages of the river. For the Most High then showed them signs, and held still the flood, till they were passed over. For through that country there was a great way to go, namely of a year and a half. And the same region is called Arsereth."
Arsereth is the region just to the west of the Black Sea. Israel had entered Europe. The Greeks were aware of these newcomers to Europe and called them Cimmerioi, Cimmerians in English. The Roman name Cimbri and the word Celt are both derivatives of Cimmerian. After the forces of Babylon had conquered the once great Assyrian Empire, they then invaded that part of Media the Gimri, who had not escaped, had settled. Pushed on northwest by the Babylonians, they headed for the Caucasus Mountains, to Daryl Pass, and into the area of South Russia, then called Scythia. It is interesting to note that this pass through the Caucasus is still called the Pass of the Israelites. The Syrians called the Gimri Iskuzi, or House of Isaac. The Persians, on the other hand, called them Saka. The Greeks called them Scuths, or Scythians. All these names have the same basic root form, SK, which are all derivatives of Isaac. Different names, but one people. Beside the ancient trade route between Babylon and Ecbatana, carved on the side of the mountain by Darius the Great, is a massive rock carving at Behistun. The inscriptions were carved in 3 languages, Akkadian, Edomite, and Old Persian. They all told the same story. This is a sketch of the paneling made in the 19th century. They show that the Babylonian Akkadian name of Gimri was written Saka on the Persian inscription, proving that the Gimri and the Saka were the same people. On one of the carvings ordered to be done by Darius, he boasts of his capture of some of these Saka. Evidently, it was an event worth recording, and the Saka prisoners are shown wearing tall, conical hats, found at a later date in the tombs of the Goths and Scythians in Eastern Europe. Not all Israel migrated westward. Preserved in the permafrost of southeast Russia and southern Siberia Mummified bodies in frozen tombs have been found by the archaeologists, showing unmistakable Caucasian features. These bodies have been carbon dated to the exact period when Israel was migrating away from Assyria and Media. One group, identified as the Massagetae, moved northeast into the very area where the bodies were found. These well-preserved corpses not only had Caucasian features, but they were mostly blond with long noses, deep-set eyes, and were long-skulled. Near the town of Sebashi, at an archaeological site dated to the 5th century BC, the body of a woman wearing a conical cap was found, similar to those worn by the Saka prisoners on the Behistun rock face. Excavated from Scythian tombs north of the Caucasus Mountains have been found superbly fashioned goldwork, showing in fine detail lifelike portraits of some Scythians, descendants of the Hebrew Israelites. Here are two Scythians mounted on their hardy ponies. Fighting back to back, Scythians using the longbow, reminding us of the little tribe of Benjamin that had 280,000 men of valor that bare shields and drew the bow. But it was not always fighting. They were cattle raisers and farmers, and here a ewe is being milked. Scenes from everyday life are depicted on this gold vase. Here an archer is stringing his bow in exactly the same way that a modern archer does it. Here a warrior is binding up a friend's wounded leg. Scythians got toothache just like everybody else. This looks like a tooth pulling, evidently without anesthetic. Here is a superbly fashioned ceremonial comb with a finely detailed scene of activity at the top. The Scythians, like their Celtic descendants, had a love of animals, and crafted here is the mythical antelope. They gave it a curvilineal mane, also in later Celtic fashion. Horses played a major part in the life of the Scythian, as they did in the opening up of the American West. This superb workmanship shows us just how the migrating people of Israel looked. Now to get back to the tracing of the lost tribes of Israel, so-called. Under mounting pressure from the Medes and Persians, these Scythians, the eastern branch of the Israel people, moved northwest, coming into contact with a western group, the Cimmerians, also Israel, who had settled for a time in the Carpathian region. But their original kinship, lost during the ensuing centuries, inevitably brought on battles between the two groups. Urged on northwest by the Scythians, the Cimmerians started a slow migration through Central Europe with their wagon trains, sheep, and cattle. They might have resembled great American westward trek. Their settlements became known to historians as the Hallstatt and Latène cultures. Around 300 BC, the Scythians were in their turn pushed out of the area by a non-Israelitish people, the Sarmatians. And like the Cimmerians, the Scythians also migrated slowly northwestward along the river valleys of the Dnieper, Don, and Danube, following the setting sun toward new lands they were not even aware of on the coastlands and islands of northwest Europe and the Baltic Sea. As they reached these northern coastlands, they settled in scattered groups, possibly in some instances, into their original tribal families. Although called Germanic tribes by the Romans, they were so called so as not to confuse them with the Sarmatians, who now occupied Scythia. The Romans named them Germani, from the Latin word genuine. We know them today as Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Danes, and Vikings. The Celts, for the most part, moved across France and Belgium into Britain to form the bedrock of the British race. Some remained in France to be known as Gauls. Some went as far south as Spain to be known as Ibrius, the Gaelic name for Hebrews. Spain today is known as the Iberian Peninsula. Many of the latter migrated into Ireland, where they became known as Scots, so named from their Hebrew ancestors, Skoda. Large numbers of them